Welcome everybody to my podcast, Big Little Small Talk. I'm Megan O'Hara-Sullivan and I love to talk, but I also love to listen. If you're new here, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome listeners to Big Little Small Talk. We're here today with someone who you would all be familiar with. He's a long-standing personality here in the Darling Downs, a radio personality, a journalist, a storyteller, and his name is David Iliffe. Welcome, David, to Big Little Small Talk.
Megan, thank you very much for having me. It's an honour.
Oh, well, it's an honour to have you. Your voice would be so familiar. How many years have you been broadcasting here in Toowoomba?
Oh, here in Toowoomba since 2009, and most of that has been getting up at the crack of dawn, so that's why I always say don't ask me to do the maths, but a long time, long enough to sort of feel like part of the community, which is good.
And I think, you know, that voice at the end of the radio, you wake up in the morning, you drive to work, you would be so dearly held to so many people, I think.
Well, you don't realise that sometimes, I think, because when you've been doing it for a long time, I mean, I love it, you know, I do love the job, there's no doubt about it, but it's only when you go out and do outside broadcasts or you go and speak to a group or something and you meet people afterwards that you realise what value that company is, which you don't sort of realise. You hope that you're choosing interesting people to talk to and, you know, you plan interviews and research interviews, but 9 times out of 10 people will come up and just say, you know, you've been on the radio, you know, in our kitchen when we've been making breakfast and having breakfast since for as long as I can remember. And then you think, wow, I have been doing it for a long time. And B, it's less about the interviews and more just about being a welcoming voice and being good company. And that's a real honour, you know. Yeah. It does make you think that you could probably just get on air and just have a chat with fellow presenters and you know, maybe we put too much effort into it. But yeah, but I think it's you're aware that it is that company thing, and that's a real privilege to be that for people, I think. Yeah.
How tricky is it to have longevity in a job like that? I would imagine that you know, they're looking at ratings, maybe not so much with the ABC, but in commercial radio, I know Lee Faulkner's been here for a long time. Is that unusual nowadays?
I think it's probably more normal in the regions, I think, than probably in the capital cities. I mean, Lee's been there, you know, for so long, you know, he's virtually become part of the furniture as well. I think with the ABC, they probably don't look at ratings as much as, say, the commercials do. But having said that, if, you know, they might do ratings or buy into ratings maybe once a year, and if they found consistently that, you know, the ratings were well down or they were getting a lot of people complaining about one particular presenter, then they probably would act on it. But I don't think it's quite as cutthroat in the capital cities where, you know, gee whiz, sometimes if you know, bomb in the ratings maybe twice in a row or something, they'd start looking at what wasn't working, you know. And so I think probably the question, it's more a challenge, is how long can you keep sort of getting up at that hour, because my alarm goes off at 4:15 and you never really get used to it. And even though I've been doing it for a long time, and I was doing breakfast radio in Tasmania before I came up here and had a brief reprieve when I did Drive for 3 years when I first came up here and then back on to breakfast. And you can never go to bed early enough to compensate for that, because, you know, like most of the time, I mean, I should really have to be in bed by 7:30 and lights out by 8 to get the full 8 hours. But no matter how tired you are, you just can't really do that. So you've always got this sleep debt that resembles, you know, like the actual debt of a third world country or something, you know, and you can never catch up. But you know, but for as long as I enjoy it, it's great. And there are pluses to working those hours as well. You know, you have the afternoons off and more time to do jobs around the house. So,
oh,
you know,
great.
Everybody wins.
That's right, that's right.
Except for me.
That's right. Well, I want to talk some more about you in a little while, David, but what I want to talk to you today about is your fascinating parents. Now, I can remember when I first met you many years ago, you said that you are one of 2 sons of Melody and Jim Iliffe, who were a seminal part of Brisbane television back in the 1950s, I think, was the beginning, 60s perhaps.
Yep.
So now your mother, Melody, who was Welsh, she was born in Bundaberg, and she was the first woman to win a Logie for news reading. And we want to talk about that in a little bit too. But can you talk about her beginnings? She was born in Bundaberg. How did she become a producer on the Channel 9 your father's show? That's as right, a production assistant? How did she go from Bundaberg to that?
Well, when she grew up in Bundaberg, and I'm not sure what the impetus was for her, but she just always wanted to work on radio. And in Bundaberg, there was only one radio station besides the ABC, was 4BU. And so but also in those days, there were a lot more jobs off air. Like the whole radio industry has changed hugely. I mean, this is going back to the early 1950s, I guess. But the whole industry has changed a lot. So I think her first job at 4BU, they would never just put you straight on air, no matter how much you begged them or no matter how much you told them it was your destiny or whatever. They didn't go for that. You had to do your time. So she was a record librarian, which is incredible now that music is just sent to you electronically and the computer sorts it itself, and even what you play is spat out of a computer and you're told. But there was a job for a record librarian. And there was she did that for a couple of years at 4BU in Bundaberg. And there was one time that the afternoons announcer, I think, or someone who just played classical music, and no one plays classical music outside of Classic FM now, for an hour. They were off sick. So they said to Mum, to Mel, okay, Mel, you can do this, but you can't talk. So you can just play the songs that whatever his name was has set out for this hour, but you're not allowed to introduce them or back announce them. So Mum said that she rang up her parents all excited. When you listen between 1 and 2, you won't hear me talk, but when you hear the music, that's me putting the needle on and playing them. And she was so excited. But then, she eventually got on air and loved it. But in the end, she decided to move to Brisbane because that's what everyone else was doing. And she worked at 4BK, I think it was, or maybe 4BH, but again, not on air. It was like on air was this sacred territory that someone had to die before you got that opportunity. So she was a record librarian down there. So it was a lot harder, I think, to get on air, in those days, both in regionals and in capital cities, than it is now. So really, when she ended up on television, that was really she went from being on air at 4BU to being off-air roles for a long, long time, and then a bit like 4BU being sort of thrown in at the last minute because someone was sick, being the voice announcer, and suddenly they got all these calls saying, who's that fantastic voice? Because she really did have a wonderful voice. So it was all down to chance, her opportunities. It's quite an amazing story, really. Yeah.
That's right. And so how did she get the job then? Had she always been on the Channel 9ers, and was that always your father's show, or?
Yeah, so it's at that time when, because television started in 1959 in Queensland, but it had been going, I think, for maybe 2 or 3 years in Melbourne and Sydney, so it was a very gradual rollout. But at the time that television was starting in Brisbane, and QTQ9, where Mum and Dad worked, was the first one. But the logical place, because no one had ever done television before, the logical place to find the people you were going to put on air and the people who were going to fill any of the off-air roles was radio, because that was the only other broadcasting business that was around. So at the time, it must have been incredible. I mean, considering now how keenly fought after any job on television in a capital city is, at the time it must have just been like, if you put your hand up, you'll get a Guernsey. So everyone else in the 4BH studio, any job down there, off air or on air, everyone was just going up the mountain. So Mum didn't want to be the only one left at 4BH, and all her mates were going up the mountain. So she just put her hand up, and it was basically, oh yeah, you can do this. It was like sort of filling spots on a roster almost. So Mum ended up with this job, which had never existed at the time, which was production assistant, I think, for this kids show called the Channel 9ers. And yeah, so they, Mum and Dad sort of met there and developed a relationship there, even though Dad was 16 years Mum's senior, but we might get to that. But her on-air role was just purely by accident, because they used to have, and this is another example of how television has changed, they used to have a booth announcer. So if you watch commercial television and someone comes on the commercial breaks and says, up next, who's going to get voted off on Survivor, blah, blah, blah. Well, that used to all be done live. So the booth announcer, that was their job. And a bit like 4BU, the booth announcer on this particular day had been called in sick or something at a moment's notice. So they put the call out, has anyone here done radio? And Mum goes, oh yeah, I have. And so like, oh, read this. Yeah, you sound all right. Okay, you're on the booth announcer for this afternoon, blah, blah, blah. So Mum loved that. But all these calls started coming in saying, who was this fantastic voice? You know, who is that woman? She sounds wonderful. We want to hear more of it. And so I'm not sure what the transition was, but eventually they were looking for someone to read news. And they thought, well, if there's been that reaction to her voice, just her voice, then, you know, she looks all right, so she'd probably be great as a newsreader. I don't think they realised at the time how groundbreaking that was, because there was no other female newsreader on air, either in Brisbane or Melbourne or Sydney or any of the major markets, anywhere in Australia at the time. But it just came about just like chance.
Imagine being a fly on a wall when someone pitched that idea and said, how about we get Melody to do it? And no, mate, we can't do that.
Exactly.
She's a female.
And,
so
these days they'd have to run it past, you know, half a dozen test audiences or something, whereas then it was just up to the nous or the gut feeling of the station manager at the time.
So then she goes on to become the first woman in Australia to read a primetime television news bulletin. And not only that, she wins a Logie for it. So
yes.
She's the first female news presenter to win a Logie. And what did it say on the Logie? Can you remember?
I can indeed, and we often laugh about this. It said, acknowledged ability in a man's domain. Can you imagine anyone getting an award with that sort of inscription?
Slap down.
Now, oh my goodness! And I did. I could show you later, but I found some photos. My sister, who's a fantastic archivist, when both my parents passed away, there was heaps of photos, some of which that I didn't even know existed. And so I was just going through some of them this morning so that I could show you. And there are just the tone of some of the publicity photos was very sexist at the time, you know. And Mum and I have never talked about it when she was alive, but I don't think it would have been quite as obvious back then, because that was just the way society was. You know, love it or hate it, that's just the way things were. And it was very much accepted that, you know, you were doing a job that was very much a man's job, you know, but that soon changed. But like there's a photo there of Don Seckham helping Mum put a makeup on. I mean, could you imagine, you know, what would a man know about this? It was just so, the whole tone was so, you know, oh yes, we'll let you into the boys' club, you know, because you seem to show a bit of promise, sort of thing. But yeah, that was just the tone of the times. Yeah.
And her voice was so renowned, as you said, and I read somewhere where someone said, diction, beautiful voice, and instrument that hit all the right notes. So it was obviously something that really resonated with people.
Yeah, and I don't know why. I know that at the time, probably all round, but Mum, and this is where just that confluence of influences, you know, will all create, you know, what Mum sort of became. But Mum's mother, my grandmother, was very into speech and drama. So I would imagine probably at the time a lot of parents wanted their children to be able to speak properly, you know, and enunciate and you know, diction and all of that. So they would send them along to something like the June Dally Watkins School of Deportment, where it wasn't just how you carry yourself but how you spoke. So Mum went through all that and also did speech and drama and went into a Stedfords in Bundaberg in the speech and drama thing, mainly because her mother wanted her to, but she enjoyed it as well. And I think so that probably gave her that diction. And she was also a choir singer from a very young age, so I suppose her voice was polished or honed through singing. But I just think her mother being into, you know, such a dramatist probably helped her as well, even though she probably wasn't aware of it at the time. But when I think back on it, it was probably those, you know, amalgamation of all those factors that made Mum's presentation style so good.
And yet she didn't have that sort of fake English accent that a lot of the early newsreaders had, didn't they? Particularly some of the men.
You're right. Although, and I think at the time, everyone did, and I don't know that it was probably good that Mum didn't, and I think it was particularly the men. You're right. When you listen to journalists, I was watching a documentary on ABC the other night that was set in 1969 or something, and they all tried to sound like they were English, and it was ridiculous. And I don't think that was so much the case for the women, so Mum didn't really have that. But having said that, even now, a mate of mine has posted about a year ago some ads that Mum did in the 70s for an electrical retailer called Chandler's. And that was, Mum became known in the 70s as the Chandler's lady.
But quickly tell me the joke. Why don't you buy a bed from Chandler's?
So Chandler's slogan was always, we stand behind the product we sell. So Mum would love $1 for every time she went to a wedding where the best man made his speech. And don't buy your bed from Chandler's, because Melody Iliffe stands behind the product she sells, and she'll be there. So, good dad jokes, they rule. But I play them now, and Mum's voice sounds so clipped and so proper. And it was all those things that people obviously liked about it are there, that great diction, but people don't talk like that now. And as much as I could admire Mum's skill, Chandler's would never choose Mum now if, the situation was brought forward now to do their ads, because her style would be too old-fashioned. So it's just a matter of sort of times move on, I guess.
And what's popular at the time. I'll just remind the listeners that they're on 4DDB, and you're with me, Megan O'Hara-Sullivan, in Big Little Small Talk. And we're speaking with David Iliffe today. He's talking about his parents, Jim and Melody Iliffe, who were part of a vanguard of children's television in Brisbane in the early 60s and 70s. David, tell me about what it was like with your mother's fame. What was that like? What age would you have been then?
Mum started...
When she won the Logie.
When she won the Logie, my brother would have only just... No, actually, that would have been pre-kids. So Mum and Dad were married, but she still took her maiden name, so it's still to Melody Welsh on the Logie Award. But my brother wasn't born till 65, and I wasn't born till 69. So all of this is just things that I've seen video of and everything. So by the time I was sort of an age that I would remember things, Mum had stopped reading the news, but she was very much doing Chandler's ads, and she went back to doing weekend news. So I don't know why, I think she just wanted to keep her hand in. So every weekend, Saturday and Sunday, Mum and Dad were big entertainers, and so we'd often have family round or guests around for a barbecue on a Sunday. And my memory is always of Mum having to, sneak upstairs or basically withdraw from the party and go upstairs and do her makeup, and at 5 o'clock she'd have to hit the road up to the mountain to be ready for the 6 o'clock news. And sometimes us kids would go with her and, sit in the corner of the studio and watch it all unfold, which was just fantastic. At the time we didn't think anything of it, but it was a great opportunity.
And what about being recognised? Like if you're out at Indooroopilly Shopping Town or something, would people recognise you?
Yeah,
what was that like as a kid,
absolutely.
As a kid of a famous person?
It's odd that, because I don't remember that as being, in some ways, and this will sound really conceited, but it's not. It's just probably the order that I came as the third child. To me, that's, as long as I can remember, Mum and Dad had always been sort of famous in some way. Whatever they did had changed, but there was always some element of fame. So to me, it wasn't really that big a deal. But Mum used to always have... Mum wasn't... She didn't seek out fame, or she didn't relish fame, and nor did Dad. They were just not... That's just not who they were. This was just a job they did. But Mum was filming something at Chandler's at Indooroopilly Shopping Town one afternoon. And so they were taking a break, and so she was just sitting out on one of the seats out in the mall, having a cigarette. She used to smoke in those days, probably, or having a Coke or something. Coca-Cola. And she was sitting back to back with these two teenage girls who said, "Oh, look, they're filming something at Chandler's. Oh, they're doing an ad. Oh, I wonder if Melody Iliffe's there." And Mum just said, "She is." And they'll go, "Oh, my goodness."
So, David, it wouldn't be a stretch to think all of that early exposure to that sort of medium. Is that what stimulated your love, do you think, of broadcasting?
Not at all. Not at all. And it's really odd, because people often assume that. And I suppose maybe subliminally it did. But I think, most kids would probably run a mile than want to, consciously choose what their parents do. That's not always the case. And it wasn't a conscious thing. But I don't know, I just, as a kid growing up, I didn't see what Mum and Dad did as being all that bigger deal. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do right through high school. I was one of these kids who just had no idea. I had these vague ideas that I wanted to be a journalist, but I didn't really apply myself at school. I'm one of these people that probably was at school, and this is probably typical for fellas, they don't mature as quickly as as females. That's right. So
frontal lobe, we're talking.
Absolutely, and it's absolutely true. I've seen this now with my own kids, and it's 100% true. So had I gone to high school 2 years later, I probably would have been great, but I just had no idea. So I won't tell you what my TE score was, but it was pretty abhorrent.
Not a lot of not relationship counselling, career counselling at Toowong High?
No, there wasn't. No, not really at all. It was basically sit you down. Do you know what you want to do? No. Oh, well, here's a booklet that has every career under the sun. Just go through and pick one and you'll turn out fine. But a friend of my father actually ran a radio presenting school called AirTV, the Australian Institute of Radio and Television, which he ran with John Knott since the late 60s through till about 1990, I think it was. And so a friend of my brother's named Guy Dobson had done Dad's course. He decided in grade 12 that he wanted to be a radio presenter. And he'd done it, it was only a night course, so he'd done it while he was at senior. On his last day of school, that coincided with when he finished AirTV, he applied for the first job that he saw, which he got, which was at 4CD in Gladstone, which was a commercial station, went up there, moved into a caravan, in a caravan park that overlooked the aluminium smelter. And as a teenager, I thought that was something to aspire to. I thought, how glamorous could you get? On the first day of his job, he got to interview the lead singer of My Sex, which were a huge band at the time. You'd remember My Sex, Megan, I'm sure. And I just
very
thought...
electronic My Sex, wasn't
they
it?
were, yes, and very sort of robotic movements. So huge they were. And I just thought, that's the life for me.
Isn't it
so then I started to take a vague interest in what Mum and Dad did.
The wood for the trees, because your mate's up there doing it.
Yeah, it's weird. And I'm sure that, Dad in particular, I mean, Dad was never, someone must follow in the footsteps. But I think all parents probably secretly hope that maybe they've had some sort of influence over their kids. But I think Dad was probably just a little bit relieved that maybe someone was at least taking an interest. But yeah, it was never what Mum and Dad did. Because I suppose what they did it was a bit, like I certainly didn't want to go and do ads, and Dad had been out of television for a long time by then. So I suppose even though they'd made such a mark in media, it wasn't in jobs that I was overly interested in doing. So I suppose there wasn't that direct influence either, I guess. But you might say I was a late bloomer.
Like most boys, as
That's
you say.
That's right, exactly. Yeah.
Just before we finish talking about your mum, preparing for this interview, David, what struck me was how much stuff was available on the web, and how much footage. Is that a weird feeling to be able to... I suppose you've seen all of it, or the stuff of your mother, but I did read this lovely tribute to her after she had died, and she died in 2017, I
That's
believe.
Right. Yep.
And it was a lady who, and you mentioned it before, it was a lady who knew your mother through the Wesley Breast Clinic, and she said she was always just such a lovely person to be at the desk, and I thought, she just seemed like such a lovely woman, lovely, warm. And do you think that was a big part of her personality, that she was very warm? Yeah,
I think so. She, and also I think the fact that, and Mum and Dad were both like this, that they didn't, media had never, well, I suppose in Mum's case she had aspired to it, but they'd never got caught up with the status of it or the fame. It was always, I want to do this because this is a job that I want to do. But neither of them were ever big on the fame thing. Not that they rejected it or avoided being out in public, because that was part of the job, but they never sought after or relished the fame side of it. So I think, Mum that was just how Mum was. She was a very warm and giving and generous person. I was amazed at the amount of time that Mum would put in, helping me with homework and that sort of thing. And, she lived for her family, extended family, her direct family and friends. And that was all that life was to her. And I think probably just that there was none of that conceitedness or sort of air of superiority that sometimes, not always, but probably more so in those days, I think, than now, that you get with some media personalities. Mum and Dad were never like that. So I think, that's a lovely tribute. And in terms of all the stuff that's there, I think that's great, because I remember when Dad passed away, which was 2005, and there was probably a lot of stuff there that Mum and Dad had kept, but I wasn't aware that any of it was there. And so Spencer Housen in Brisbane, as I was working for the ABC at the time, Dad had done a couple of interviews with Spencer, and he'd done a longer conversation hour type interview with Peter Gooch, who started that format that Richard Fidler took over. And Spencer sent me this hour-long interview that Peter Gooch had done with Dad, and it was sort of like, oh my God, we've got this. It was like a warm blanket being put over me, because I didn't think that I had anything left of Dad at all. So it's great, that electronic thing, that fact that the public or the world will keep track of things that you perhaps haven't bothered to put aside yourself is just wonderful. Because if it was 40 years before or something, if you didn't keep stuff like that yourself, then it was lost to time.
And so, particularly having a recording and a visual. So I want to talk about your dad. As per usual, I'm probably going to run out of time too much. But just tell me about the trip that you and your siblings did on the GAN with your mum.
That was great. It was so fantastic. Because Dad died in 2005, and Mum was quite well then when Dad died. But Mum was the type... And it wasn't a situation that Dad played on. It's just the way it turned out that Mum was quite happy to defer everything to Dad in terms of, paying the bills and looking after, could we afford house extensions? Yes, we could. Could they afford to put a pool in? Yes, they could. That was Dad's. That's just, Mum was happy to leave all that to Dad. So when Dad passed away, Mum suddenly was inundated with all this stuff that she didn't have any understanding. And I think, so that probably accelerated Mum ended up dying of dementia in 2017. But it was a very slow and very gradual, descent, if you like. You wouldn't have even called it dementia, I suppose, initially, but it was sort of this overall feeling of helplessness that I guess probably kicked in maybe 5 years after Dad died. But then she was diagnosed with dementia, and, she had to move into a nursing home, and my sister was aware that Mum had always said that when Dad died, at the time he died, one of the things they'd always wanted to do was to take a trip on the GAN. So, and Mum had some money left in her account that she would be happy to pay for it. So my sister organised for Mum and my sister and myself, no partners or anything, just basically the family, to go on to do this trip that Mum had always wanted to take.
And your other brother?
And my other brother Chris, yeah. So Chris, Ingrid and myself. And which was very weird, because it was almost like going back to living at home again. It was the most bizarre thing, but it was just fantastic. And, Mum, I think she was still well enough to appreciate it, but we were also able to see, how she was declining, but she still really, really enjoyed it. And it was just one of those priceless trips, that you would very rarely get a chance to take. I don't think any of us three kids could have afforded to do it that way by ourselves. And but just to spend that quality time with Mum, I think about aspects of that trip every day, and that was back in 2016, so it was superb. It was really
couldn't have been better, to be confined like that, and yet have enough sort of space, and yet to spend all of that really close time together. It's just beautiful.
Absolutely.
I remember you coming back and saying how much you enjoyed it. But as you say, the dynamics of going back to where you fit in the family.
That's right.
Who's the boss, and who's the bossy one, and who's the...
Yeah, absolutely.
The roles that you play.
And those lines sort of became clearly defined, not in a bad way at all, but, things don't change, and that's good. That was a good thing, but it was just unusual to be back in that dynamic again, but really quite comforting as well. Yeah.
I'll just remind the listeners that they're on 4DDB, and you're with me, Megan O'Hara-Sullivan, in our segment called Big Little Small Talk, and today we're talking to David Iliffe. We've just been speaking about his groundbreaking mother, Melody, who was the first woman to win a Logie for news presenting in Australia, mind you. And now we're going to talk about the extraordinary career of your father, who had a huge military life before he became a children's television presenter. So he was captured by the Japanese. He had shrapnel in his leg. He stole a boat. He stole food. They were on the open sea for 3 days, landed on an island, rescued by Dutch soldiers.
That's right. What
sort of man was he besides looking like Thomas Keneally?
He looked incredibly like Thomas Keneally. You're absolutely right. He was just a life of adventure. It was quite incredible. And I gave a talk at Cobinco. They invited me because I told Jeff, the curator there, Dad's story just in conversation. He said, "Oh, that'd make a good curator conversation." So that sort of made me put it all together, and really, really proud, because Dad, a bit like Mum, Dad's life was probably just a result of things that just happened that he took advantage of. So he was 17, not old enough to sign up for the war when they declared war, and he was up in King's Cross at the time, and all of his mates were signing up, so he signed up and managed to. I don't think they did great checks about age and that sort of thing. They just wanted everyone they could get. And a whole heap of amazing things that happened before they even left Australia. But then the whole escape from Singapore was, to me, an amazing story, because the Allies had surrendered at the time, but the Japanese soldiers hadn't come into Singapore, and they all knew that had they waited to be captured, they would have ended up on the Thai-Burma Railway. And Dad was injured at the time. We were talking about this just the other night, because my son and I watched the Colin Firth film, The Railway Man, which is a fantastic film, highly recommend it. But that whole thing that happened to those gentlemen could well have happened to Dad. There wasn't a lot of mercy. If you were injured, you were no good to them. So you either would have been worked to death, or, you would have fallen behind and probably been killed. Who knows? But it wouldn't have been a good situation. So, Dad and his mates, and Dad, the fact that Dad was injured at the time, his mates still went up and made sure that they got him when they hatched this plan to steal this boat, even though an injured man would have, been a bit of a drag and would have sort of hindered their progress. But that was that Aussie mateship, they weren't going to leave him behind, which is amazing, I think. But, just that whole story of then, getting to Sumatra and then having to find a ship home, and the ship that they nearly got on ended up being bombed. It was a ship that was filled with nurses and was bombed in one of the straits there, but the ship they ended up on, got them home. And the whole time, Dad's family thought that he was dead, or missing in action. That's, you presume after a certain amount of time, that he'd been killed. So he got back to Australia and was able to give them a call from a phone box, and that's just amazing. I just can't get over that. But then, he was honourably discharged because of his injury, so they gave all soldiers or former soldiers the opportunity to go and learn to be pilots over in Canada on the government, and quite a few soldiers did. Dad did, and then, because he'd always wanted to fly, that was so that they could be fighter pilots. But by the time he'd done his training, the war was over, so he came back and became a commercial pilot, and I think that led to the whole Captain Jim scenario. He still had his pilot's cap and everything from commercial pilot, so that was just a good outfit and a good persona that he could become on television, Captain Jim, King of the Kids. But everything was just purely by chance,
So how did he make the leap from being really Captain Jim to Captain Jim television presenter?
Well, that was, again, just that time in Brisbane when television was starting up. The logical place to source both on-air and off-air talent was from radio. So virtually everyone on radio, unless they were shy and bashful and didn't want the spotlight, were leaping at the chance to be on television.
So how did he make the leap from pilot to radio then?
Well, that was, he'd always had an interest in radio, but I'm not sure how seriously he'd taken it. He was working as an advertising copywriter at the time that he signed up to go to war. But from a young age, he was fascinated by radio, and he writes in his diaries that his father took him after school one day up to 2GB in Sydney, and they got there in the evening to watch the evening show being presented, and these people, the presenters, were dressed up in dinner suits. And, he asked his father, why are they doing that? And his father asked the engineer, and the engineer said, well, they're presenting a program at dinner time, so they have to feel the part. They have to be in the zone sort of thing. And Dad was just fascinated by the whole world of radio. So he just put his hand up. He ended up flying. He was based in Inverell, up in northern New South Wales. And a job came up at 2NZ in Inverell, and he'd done a little bit of radio while he was in Canada at a sort of a station within the army base there. And so he just hopped in there and got the job and did that for a few years, met his first wife, and then I'm not sure why they wanted to go to Brisbane, but they decided to move to Brisbane. I know why he left 2NZ, but he in Brisbane, he had arrived and went into 4BC just to introduce himself, and they had just finished interviews for an afternoon announcer position. No, not taking any more. But Dad, because he had the gift of the gab, got talking to the manager, and after about an hour of not a formal interview, he got the job. So he ended up doing it wasn't music back then, it was like a kids radio program. It was on after school. So that then translated to him being a logical kids television presenter. And Dad, I think, just adapted to television without any problem at all, because he was just that sort of gregarious person. So again, just the things happen by chance that probably just wouldn't happen like that these days. It's amazing.
Unfortunately.
Yeah,
David,
that's right.
You mentioned that was his first wife. Did he have any children with his first wife?
Yes, yeah, he had one son, Peter. Yeah, so Peter was always sort of our we always call him stepbrother, but he essentially a half brother. So Peter was always this, not mysterious figure. We got to know him quite well, but we'd go around and see him every Christmas. And Peter was successful in his own right. He was a puppeteer, and then started a computer company and got interested in that, and was quite wealthy. Then ran a restaurant. He owned the 12th Night Theatre in Brisbane for quite some time, because that's where they had originally done puppet shows. He was just a real entrepreneur. So every year the Christmas gifts that Peter would give us would become more lavish or unusual. So it was always a highlight of our year to go and see Peter on Christmas Eve. But then as we got older and got to know him, it became a really good relationship as well. So he was just like our brother, only much, much older. But yeah.
What a fascinating story. Tell me about growing up with a father that's larger than life figure, the military career, the pilot, the television personality. Was he the alpha male or not like that at all?
Not at all. No, that wasn't Dad. I mean, Dad, there was a big generation gap, I think, between me and Dad, because Dad was 49, because Mum was his second marriage, and I was the youngest of three. And there's 3 years between 2 years between me and my sister, and then 3 years between my brother and I. So by the time I came along, Dad was 49, which I didn't realise was not significant to me at the time until I turned 49. And I thought, and my kids were, probably, in their teens then, and it just hit me, my God, this idea of having a new child and changing nappies and all that when you're 49 is just extraordinary. But so there was a big generation gap, but not in a bad way, not in a negative way. But, Dad didn't sort of quite get, I think, particularly when we became teenagers, why we were into some things, and why we, when he dropped us off to school, he had to park, 5 kilometres away, had to appear like we just had walked all the way to school, because that was cool. But what I was always aware of, though, was that Dad was just such a gifted speaker. So you'd get dragged along as a teenager, to some events that Dad would have to host. Long after he was on television, he was still asked to host things. That's how big his reputation was. And he was a member of Rotary, so he was just the go-to person to host anything. And even as a teenager, even before I wanted to do radio, I was just in awe of my dad's ability to just get up and speak, and pick up a microphone and speak in a way that people just heard him, and he wasn't that alpha male. He didn't play on it, but it was just that old-fashioned thing that he knew how to present. He knew how to call people to attention. He had that easy manner. He knew when to tell a joke. He had, a library of jokes in his head, and he was just a gifted presenter. And I was always in awe of that, or admiring of that. And so was Mum too. Like, neither of them were really big on radio and all that, but Mum used to always, we'd go home after something like that, and Mum would always say something like, "You did good, Jim." And I'd be saying, yeah, he really did. So, yeah.
So what was their relationship like? Can you remember? Like, was he ever freaked out by her fame, or do you think they were real equals?
No, real equals. Dad just never, wanted any. In fact, it's funny, and Mum only told me this probably about 3 weeks before she died. We didn't talk a lot. I thought I knew all the stories of how she'd got her job in television and how her and Dad got together. But one thing I didn't know that she told us, but told me one time when I went to see her by myself, there was we had a photo album in the room that she was staying in, so she was in a fairly high care nursing home by then, but they'd said, if you put together a photo album of old shots, that's often good to jog memories of people with Alzheimer's and dementia. So we had this and we were looking through it, and Mum said, gee, I didn't want to be a television newsreader. It wasn't something that I'd sought out. She didn't say it in these words, but she said, I just loved being production assistant on television, on your dad's show and whatever show. To me, that was the dream job. So when they came and said, do you want to, we'd love you to be a newsreader, she said, I'll do it on one condition, that I can still be a production assistant as well, and I'll just read news at night. But unless I can hang on to my old job, then I don't want to do it. And Dad said to her, or she told me that Dad said to her, no, you really should. This is a fantastic opportunity. You should embrace this. You can't do two jobs, but this will be really good for you. But she had to be talked into it. And so Dad wasn't jealous at all. It was never a competitive thing whatsoever. It's just not how they were.
Good for Jim, I say.
Absolutely, yeah.
Maybe him being a little bit older, and
I think
he was
so.
very supportive.
Yeah.
Now, David, I'm getting to the end of my time, unfortunately.
Yeah,
you then go on. No, it's been a joy. It's been such a privilege to hear the story. You go on to become a broadcaster and a journalist in your own right. You spent some time down in Broken Hill in Tasmania before you came up here. You get married and you have two boys.
That's right.
We talked before about going on the GAN with your mum. I know one of your boys is, or was, very obsessed with trains. Is that...
Right.
Tell me about your two boys.
Yep. So both my boys were diagnosed with autism fairly early, but they're high-functioning autism. So it's, without getting too bogged down in the definition, in both cases, I think when they were young, if they were here with us now, you'd notice in a myriad ways, but now I think you'd barely notice at all. But Ben, my youngest, one typical trait of autistic boys in particular is latching on to one particular interest and milking it for all it's worth. So Ben was always really quite obsessed with trains. Started with Thomas and then developed into real trains, without faces on the front. And now it's just developed into fascination with anything historic, so he's a real Anglophile. So he's going to take me to England at the end of this year, paid for by himself, which tell you what, talk about kids keeping you in the style that you weren't accustomed to. It's fantastic. I'm hoping he doesn't change his mind. Now I'm trying to suck up to him. But so he was always, he wanted to go on this particular trip on the GAN. And at one stage there was speculation, I can't remember why, but that my brother might not be able to go. And I remember, I don't think I said it to Ingrid, my sister, who was organising it, but I was going to say, Ben could go, don't waste the space, Ben would love it, but in the end he didn't get to go. But
You talked about having to park up the street when making your father do that, and I think anyone who's raised teenagers. Did your boys go through similar sorts of things?
Not really, only because they ended up being homeschooled because of their being on the Asperger's, I suppose, high-functioning autism. So my wife really opted to homeschool them because the education system wasn't able to really cater to special needs kids. It still isn't, and that's not the fault of the education system. They just have to cater for the middle ground. That's the way life is. But so because there weren't as many of those situations of dropping them off to school or dropping them off to after-school activities, we didn't really get that. But I think on the plus side is that neither of my kids are really have never really been caught up in those sort of fads, those things that I must have this brand or I must have this, because they've sort of been, I mean, they've always been social, but they've never been in that schoolyard thing where fashion and how you look is a competitive thing. So thankfully, no, history didn't replicate itself in that way at all.
Good and bad.
Yeah, good and bad, definitely.
Either of them have any interest in broadcasting?
No, not at all. I think the only time Ben has ever even expressed any admiration, and I don't say this is a bad thing, I think this is quite refreshing, is I had to give a talk or take part in a panel once at something that I went to on a Sunday afternoon, and Ben came along, and at the end of it, Ben said, "Wow, so you did all that, you didn't have any notes at all, you were just talking in front of this group?" And I said, "Yeah, that's what I do, that's what my job involves." And it was like, wow, and I remember thinking, that's probably how I was with my dad, like, how do you manage to do all this without notes? But that didn't translate in him wanting to be, a radio presenter. Although every day when I get home, he says, "So, did you interview anyone interesting today?" And he always laughs because I have to look at my diary to see who I interviewed, because once you finished one program, all you're thinking about is the next day's program. So
I can't believe that you've got a teenager who asks you a question. That is good parenting on your wife's behalf.
Exactly.
I suggest.
Got to tap into that for as long as it lasts. But he does have my dad's, I think Dad passed it on to me, a natural curiosity. He's so curious about the world. Nothing's naff or daft. Everything warrants exploring further, which I think is a great trait. So, he's often very impressed by the people I get to talk to, and not famous people, just, I spoke to this person about, whatever, and he'll say, "Oh, wow, so what did they have to," he's really naturally curious. So I think if he ever wanted to get into broadcasting, it wouldn't be because of it's the media, it'd be more because of the people that you have access to, which is really the great selling point of a career in media anyway, I think.
The joy of it. Oh,
Absolutely.
It's wonderful. Now, David, my very two last questions. One, I'm going to ask you, and I don't know how you feel about the royal family. There's a fair bit swirling around at the moment with the the book Spare, coming out by Harry. If I was to ask you who your favourite royal person is, what would you answer?
I would say, and I don't know how many people would say this in answer to that question, but Kate Middleton, I think, is brilliant. It is Kate, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Such is my in-depth knowledge of the royal family. And the reason is, and it's come to light, you sort of watch people from afar, you can only rely on media coverage, but it just seems with all this scandal with Harry and Meghan, and Meghan supposedly going into the royal family only for what she could get out of it, and then them whinging about the intrusion and blah, blah, blah. And that's all legitimate. But Kate seems to be so classy because she got into it with her eyes wide open. She fell in love with William, presumably. It wasn't like her parents' marriage. It was genuine love. But if Who magazine is to be believed, that last bastion of quality journalism, at some stage William gave her the chance to escape. Go, it's a trap, run away, have a normal life. She did that for a while. She came back in fully eyes wide open, knowing that there were downsides, but there were also plus sides. You would never work independently again, but you could pursue issues that were important to you and help them through your royal persona. And she's embraced it for everything that it's worth. And I just think she's a classy lady, compared to many others who have come into the royal family. So, yeah, she would be my favourite, I think.
Excellent. You're thinking not so high on the class Richter scale was Fergie with the toe sucking.
No. That was probably a bit of a blip on the royal radar. Not that I care about it all that much, but I mean, she's an example, I suppose, of maybe she didn't know what she was getting into, or obviously it's a bit of a burden being part of that family, and if you're born into it, the horror gradually unfolds as you get older, I think. But if you marry into it, I think you've got to go in eyes wide open, and I think out of everyone who was married into the royal family, Kate seems to have sort of taken it for what it is and embraced it for what it's worth, I think.
That would be a whole other show that we could talk about the media's role in the
absolutely,
in the royal
and
family.
I don't think the media are have clean hands by any stretch of the imagination. It's I find that really, really interesting, actually.
The phone tapping and all the rest.
Yeah.
But anyway, in our dying minute of our interview on Big Little Small Talk, David, what is the song that can't keep you off the dance floor?
Oh, that would definitely be Uptown Funk. I know it's a bit sort of, fogyish now, but, to me, that's just, it's got great, I'm a drummer and I love drumming to it, and I just love it. That would definitely get me on the dance floor without needing to have had a few drinks beforehand. So I'm not saying the result would be pretty, but that would definitely get me on the dance floor. Other people would throw me off then.
What's that line? Here's my cup, put some liquor in it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm with you. I love that song. I'm sure Leroy will be able to find it in the record library.
Oh, perhaps. Yes. Perhaps Leroy's got a record librarian willing to find it for him, perhaps. Yeah.
A little melody to
yeah, that's right, exactly.
And
they can let her on air provided she doesn't open the microphone and talk, for God's sake.
That's right. Not. David Iliffe, thank you so much for being my guest
Pleasure.
on Big Little Small Talk. It's just been a joy to hear about your family and being so open and generous with your life story. Thank you.
Pleasure. No, it's been great. Megan, thank you.
That's it for this week. Thanks for joining me on Big Little Small Talk. I hope you can make the time to join me next week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favourite podcast app.